100% error in their computer programs.
Wow.
How the loose parts monitoring heard the pipes rattling and Edison didn't do anything about it. On and on and on. But the biggest problem here, and I'll be brief, was that they plugged 1,300 tubes. They didn't need to plug that many. They only needed to plug 10. And so the question is, if they needed to plug 10, why did they plug 1,300? And again, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's not telling the truth here. The real reason is that something called a steam line break accident. If there had been a steam line break accident, all of these tubes that were damaged because they were vibrating together would have popped like popcorn and released enormous amounts of radiation, not inside the containment, but it would have gotten outside the containment. So it would have been a much worse accident than Southern California was ever prepared for. So it was bad news, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission really isn't talking about it yet.
Well, you know, as Arnie would verify, the pressure inside these tubes is incredible, because that's how you keep the steam from going supercritical. So when there's a leak in one of these tubes, it's just like some kind of cutting torch. You know, for instance, on nuclear-powered ships, when there's a steam leak, which is fairly comparable, you take a broom and you swing it in front of yourself one way and then the other way, and when it gets cut off, that's how you find the leak. You can't see the leak coming across the room. It's invisible, but it's so high pressure, it can cut through most everything. In fact, it could cut through metal, like it could cut through tubes next door. So if you start getting leaks in some of these tubes, it's pretty hard to model how much damage they could do in minutes after they start to leak.
Well, what would be the probable cause for the original puncture that starts that leak, Arnie?
They were crashing into each other. They were vibrating to the point where they just totally damaged each other.
And that's because they didn't bother with the center stay?
Well, yeah, because they put too many tubes in the first place. That created too much heat in the center of this tube sheet. And with too much heat in the center and not enough heat on the outside, they got a steam bubble that floated up in the tubes, allowing the tubes to collide with each other. And you know, Edison brought this on themselves. They could have built the same steam generator that lasted 30 years, and instead they went out and they came up with an entirely new design. And they said they wanted this one to run 60. So they were planning on running this plant for 90 years with these steam generators in it.
And no nuclear power plant, as an overall design, is meant to last that long. I mean, 40 years is really about it, and then you're starting to talk about more and more things going wrong until you shut the thing down. So a lot of these plants were expected to run for 30 or 40 years, and then they expected them to be decommissioned. And so it's kind of like in the case of Fukushima. Well, what are the chances of an earthquake and a tidal wave happening in the next 40 years? We'll have this thing taken down and out of here by the time there's ever a disaster. Well, you know, they've extended the licenses way beyond the design life of this stuff. And at the same time, nature has proven that it can be pretty unpredictable, you know, and that things do happen. You know, we have many examples of this in the past, and there was one in Russia called Chelyabinsk way back in the late 50s, where they had buried a bunch of waste in casks underground, but they had lost track of where they had them. And so the heat radiating from from each cask caused a steam explosion, which spewed the radiation up into the atmosphere, and it rained for, you know, many, many square miles all around it. And that area is still completely uninhabitable today. But the CIA said, oh, we don't want to tell Americans about that because they might be against nuclear power if they heard about it. So one of the biggest nuclear accidents on the planet, much bigger than Chernobyl, was completely covered up because, gosh, you know, we really need this nuclear power. Or I should say nuclear industrialists need this nuclear power.
There's another one that was covered up by the United States government, and that was right outside of L.A. Right outside of LA, there was a reactor in the late 50s, same time span, called Santa Susana. And it had a meltdown, and it didn't have a containment building. there are many square miles outside of LA that are contaminated even to this day, and they really don't know how to ever clean up that site. There's a lot of evidence of cancers in the surrounding communities, and again, the government tried for years to cover this up until about 1990, when the cancers just pointed a finger back toward the Santa Susana reactor. So yeah, we have a storied history of not telling the truth when we have nuclear accidents.
Well, that's amazing. I mean, Washington State has that whole decommissioned or deactivated, I guess, plant that you can't get within miles of, and they're still trying to figure out how they're going to get rid of the waste from the site. They can't move it. You've got, what would happen theoretically if this event at San Onofre would have continued?
Well, I have a comment about that, Tom, because, they all say that nuclear power, it's so great because in one station you can produce so much electricity and serve so many people. How can you compare that to any other kind of energy? But in the case of this Los Angeles plant, San Onofre, it only serves 1.5 million people with its electricity. But if this tube accident continued and the thing melted down and blew, it could kill 7.5 million people. So the whole myth that a nuclear power plant just puts out so much energy that it takes care of a huge part of the United States is completely a myth. More people would be damaged than the people served by the electricity in the case of San Onofre.
Incredible.
We on the San Onofre issue, I couldn't agree with you more. The service district is quite small, but we said it at the very beginning of the piece here. Everybody's downwind from these plants. It's not. It doesn't stop at the site boundary. That's for sure. You can have 40 great years and one bad day.
Yeah.
It just takes one bad day.
And well, that's the thing that really irritates me is it seems like the science doesn't even try and design for that bad day. It's kind of like rather than design for it, it's well, let's just put the picture up in front of that window and don't look out there because we can't do anything about it. If that day came, oh well.
Well, I don't completely agree with that, Tom, because I do know nuclear safety engineers, and these guys write protocol after protocol to try to do what they can to keep these plants safe. But they're the first to tell you that this is one great big engineering nightmare. The whole thing is. It's like the purpose of nuclear power plants was originally not to make electricity. It was to provide nuclear material for our weapons program. The people who used to regulate the nuclear industry used to be the Department of Defense. So the purpose of these plants were to make nuclear bomb material, and electricity and steam were the byproduct. So, after we had all the nuclear weapons we needed, well, now it became a business, to produce electricity with them, but it's never been cost effective. It's the most expensive electricity we have.
The Union of Concerned Scientists, did a study that said that, in fact, nuclear is about twice as expensive as what we're paying for it because of all the subsidies for the last 70 years. Instead of 5 cents, it should be 10, essentially. So I couldn't agree with you more. If you take the subsidies off the table, a lot of renewables come to the surface as being much more viable, and that doesn't even include hanging on to the nuclear waste for 250,000 years.
Well, you mean 4.5 billion years. It's only acutely toxic for 250,000, but it continues to be toxic for billions of years. But, if you think about Love Canal, right, this was the chemical dump up in the Northeast. And, after a while, they paved it over, and it sat there for a while, and developers came along and said, wow, look at that great place to put a bunch of houses. And they built a whole neighborhood on top of it. They couldn't even keep track of chemical waste for a generation. How are we going to keep track of nuclear waste for 250,000 years? It just isn't going to happen. But the corporation that made the money on that plant will be long gone by then.
You touched on something interesting, Arnie, which is subsidies. And This kind of steps outside of just looking at nuclear